Hello, good evening, and a very warm welcome to the RIBA. Thank you to everyone for coming along tonight and braving the weather, and also for coming to this event rather than the Georgian Group's awards upstairs. So there are many architecture awards out there, but the RIBA is generally the best, I would say. So this time next week at about 8:30, we'll know the winner of the 2019 Stirling Prize. For those of you who are not going to be able to join us on the evening, make sure that you're tuned into the BBC News channel to watch the live announcement. From over 600 entries this year, these are the final 6 buildings left in this year's RIBA Awards. The Stirling shortlist, the best buildings in the UK right now, and as Esther McVeigh correctly observed at the Conservative Party conference yesterday, some have even been designed in 3D and on a computer. So welcome to Stirling Stories. I'm Matthew Dobson. I'm the head of the awards here at the RIBA. Tonight is where you get to find out from each of the 6 Stirling shortlisted architects about the details of their schemes, the design philosophies that underpin them and the challenges faced along the way in realising the architectural visions behind the stunning projects we'll be exploring in more detail this evening. A few housekeeping notes. There are no fire drills planned, so if you do hear the alarm, it is the real thing. So please make your way out via the exit behind you or the doors to my left, to your right. If you're following us on Twitter, please do tag at RIBA and use the hashtag Stirling Stories. Or if you prefer to live in the moment, then we have time for a few questions for our panelists at the end of the evening. So, for example, if, like me, you want to know whether Norwich City Council have a policy of allowing parking tickets to be appealed for people driving around RIBA juries to Goldsmith Street, then please wait until the end of the evening. Our host tonight is the editor of the Architecture Review, Manon Millard. Manon has written for the Architect's Journal, Soiled, it says here, but separate magazines, and worked with the Triennial de Lisboa, the Fundació Mies van der Rohe, and for the Venice Biennale, as well as the RIBA, amongst many others. So please do join me in welcoming Manon, your host for the evening.
Hello, good evening. Thanks, Matt, for the introduction. I'm Manon, I'm the editor of the Architectural Review. I'm going to try and keep this very brief because we have a lot to go through tonight, and I'm quite keen to make sure we have enough time for the conversation and the questions. I just want to thank the RIBA first for having me and having all of us here. Congratulate the 6 practices on being shortlisted for one of or the most prestigious architectural prize in the UK. And welcome all of you for joining us tonight. So the format of the evening, so the way tonight will work is that we'll first hear from the architects themselves. Each practice will describe their design process and journey from conception to completion. The audience and myself would like to hear why each project should win the Stirling Prize and how it contributes to the discourse around the UK's best new buildings. Each practice has been asked to present their work and ideas in no more than 10 minutes. They will effectively tell us about the story behind each project. As Charles de Lint wrote, we're all made of stories. When they finally put us underground, the stories are what will go on. Not forever, perhaps, but for a time. He thinks it's, almost a sign of kind of immortality, even if obviously it's bound by limits. So I think the idea is to understand as well how the story of these particular projects today and in 2019 can sort of like help us go forward as well. Just a very kind reminder to the speakers that even though there is a timer, if things are a little bit slow, I will try to wave it to you from the front row to try and make sure we have enough time for the conversation. I will introduce the speakers just before they present each project, so one at a time. And after the first hour, we'll have half an hour for a conversation where we will, of course, welcome questions from you all. So please let us know by putting your hand up if you have one. We want to make sure that everyone who wants to speak is able to. These questions can be related to the individual projects that are being presented tonight. But I would also like us to discuss the meaning of architectural awards and prizes. The Stirling Prize is one of the only architectural events that makes it onto national television, that is discussed at length in the non-specialist press. And I think it's important for us to think about the message as a profession that we are sending out to the wider public. What conversations and debates is it triggering? What impact does it have on the practices who are shortlisted? We have a few in this year's shortlist who have either been shortlisted before or have won the Stirling Prize, so I think they might be able to shed some light on that. Some of these, and how effectively does it help us, both as a profession and as a society, to move forward? So, the first project that will be presented tonight is Cork House by Matthew Barnett Howland with Dido, Milne and Oliver Wilton. I will ask Matt and Oliver to come up on stage to present the project, and Dido will be the one who will be joining us in the conversation later on. So please welcome Matt and Oliver onto the stage.
Good evening, everyone. As well as a one-off architectural project, Cork House is also a pilot for a radical new construction system made of solid cork. But Cork House is also an approach. It's a way of thinking about a building as a life cycle and then working through each stage of the building's life in relation to its impact on natural and human resource systems. So in a way, the architecture of the Cork House is the result of using its life cycle as the starting point, if you like. It's an approach we've called form follows life cycle. So it's on these terms that we're going to describe the Cork House as 6 stages of its life cycle, starting with its raw material, which comes from the cork oak forests around the Mediterranean basin. Cork is the bark of the cork oak tree, which is harvested every 9 years using hand tools without harming the tree or really disturbing the forest. This gentle form of forestry, combined with mixed farming, creates and supports a genuinely biodiverse ecosystem. The best cork from the trunk is used for wine stoppers. And then the waste from the wine stopper industry and from the cork forestry in general is granulated. And then it's steam cooked using energy almost entirely from waste biomass from the forestry. And when it's cooked, the cork expands and it releases a natural resin inside the cork, which is called suberin. And it melts and then rebonds to form solid blocks of pure cork with no added ingredients whatsoever in the cork blocks. And expanded cork has been used in the construction industry extensively for over 100 years, and recently as external cladding, first used about 20 years ago by Alvaro Siza in the Water de Mora. Oops. So here we're going to describe the design approach. Stop it. So contemporary buildings generally have to meet a range of performance requirements, and they do so typically by starting with structure, which is insulated, vapor control and breather membranes often introduced, external framing and cladding, and internal lining and finishes, which creates a very complex wall assembly. For example, so-called brick houses these days are often, in fact, concrete or timber frame structure that only use brick really for the outer skin, which is combined with a whole range of other building components, materials, and products. And this, when they're all sort of bonded and glued and screwed together, this creates complexity at every stage of the building's life cycle, and often ends with this, destructive demolition. So the idea here was to replace each of the layers of this complex model with a single material expanded cork for the internal finish, external finish, thermal insulation, load-bearing structure, and control of moisture transfer. So the basic hypothesis was to, if you like, rethink construction and replace this complex layered model on the left with the solid cork building envelope on the right. And it's with this objective in mind that we undertook a 3-year funded research project with a team of industry and academic partners. And together, we researched and developed the solid cork building envelope using in-depth prototyping and a range of lab tests to, if you like, de-risk this new construction system for use in its first live project, the Cork House.
Okay, on to fabrication. So taking expanded cork billets, we developed a simple prefabricated construction kit that's assembled by hand on site. It's a little bit like a kind of giant plant-based Lego. The 1/2 metre thick cork blocks interlock using a tongue and groove fit with no glue or mortar. As the research developed, it soon became clear that the system would require high precision machining in order to work, and so we moved from traditional fabrication methods to develop a digital fabrication process at the Barnett. We developed the block designs in relation to the digital machine tools and developed the construction system as a whole, which then enabled us to proceed to build the house. So regarding assembly, when it came to construction, we aimed to develop a simple assembly process to complement the material simplicity of the design. The aim was to use one system for walls and roofs assembled by hand without the need for any supporting false work, and this led to the use of corbelled roofs. We developed this idea through preliminary workshop assemblies, our first prototype in 2014, 1 to 5 constructional model, second prototype 2017. And on the basis of this research, we developed the cork construction kit, which is what we used for Cork House. That comprised of removable steel screw piles, solid timber floor, cork wall blocks in compression, timber eaves beam and structural wardrobes to deal with shear and lateral loading, cork roof blocks in compression, and roof lights on top, acting a bit like paperweights to give some weight to the top of the structure. The blocks were easy to assemble by a self-builder, who was Matthew, with an assistant. And each block weighs about 12 or 13 kilos, and it's a pretty clean and dry process. And here you can see the high precision nature of the interference fit joints with no glue or mortar used.
So here we're going to describe the house as an architectural and sensory experience. The project is located on Tangier Island in the River Thames on the edge of Eton. The site was 2 gardens with a slightly awkward junction between them next to the riverbank. So the house was positioned in order to resolve this relationship and create an outdoor bay at one end, which creates a threshold between the 2 gardens, as well as an outdoor living area and an antechamber for the house itself. You pass through this bay into the garden beyond, and the rare cork-coloured cat isn't included in the kit. And it's from this garden that you first get to see all 5 roof pyramids together. As a series of living spaces, each pyramid is described its own function from the outdoor living pyramid next to the riverbank to the sleeping pyramid at the other end, to the bedroom and so on, the plan. The first thing that everyone says when they first come into the courthouse is they all comment on the lovely, woody, smoky aroma of using cooked cork. And this is just part of a very rich sensory experience you get when you first enter the courthouse, with the atmospheric balance of light and shadow, and the acoustics very calm. And because the cork is pure structure, you get a really almost physical sensation of a load coming down around you, block by block. That's the cork close up. You can see it's a lovely sort of texture. It's quite warm and soft to the touch. And this is where the wall turns into the roof. Interesting combination of sort of ancient architectural form with the precision of 21st century machining. We combine the cork and timber with warm, rich metals like brass internally, copper externally. In the bathroom, we created a slightly more playful space of illusion and reflection by way of contrast to the solidity and weight in the rest of the house.
Every building eventually gets to the point where it reaches the end of its useful life. And in order to avoid the kind of destructive demolition discussed earlier, the cork system can be taken apart as easily as it has been put together. We tested and demonstrated this with the cabin prototype that was made and assembled at UCL, and disassembled, transported to site, and reassembled. The rest of the building is also designed for disassembly, allowing for recovery of components and materials at the end of the building's life. A whole life carbon assessment indicates the house was carbon negative at completion, which is because the amount of atmospheric carbon stored in its plant-based components exceeds emissions relating to construction. This assessment indicates exceptionally low whole life embodied carbon in blue for the cork house, and also very low operational carbon in orange, partly because of the use of logs from site for heating and some photovoltaics. The result is the lowest whole life carbon in any building, for any building assessed by the consultant, considerably lower than that for the zero operational carbon building that they selected as a reference project, which is shown here. So just to summarise and wrap up, the life cycle of the cork house starts with the material from a biodiverse landscape. It uses waste and byproduct from cork oak forestry. It's cooked with no additional ingredients, using heat from waste biomass. Assembled without any glue or mortar. As a building, it has a specific form driven by its life cycle, and at the end of the building life, blocks can be disassembled for reuse, recycling into the manufacturing chain, or returned to the biosphere to biodegrade and fuel new life. That's the end.
Thanks very much, both. Next, we will hear the story of Goldsmith Street by Mikhail with Cathy, Hawley. So Annalie will come up on stage to present the project. Please welcome her to the stage.
Hello. So Goldsmith Street is a council housing project for Norwich City Council. It's 105 homes and it's Passive House certified. But before I'm going to talk about it, I wanted to talk about another project which we did where a lot of the ideas and the learning came from it, which is Clayfield in Suffolk, which was, again, it's social housing. It was for Orwell Housing Association, and it was an RIBA competition where the brief was to have a really deep green brief, very low CO2 in construction as well as use. And we got together with Bureau Happold, and they suggested we did a passive solar scheme. So, you know, kind of basic idea is that you harness winter sun to heat the houses. So you have to be careful to model the buildings so that low-level winter light hits all the windows and face them all south, which in that particular instance required quite a kind of convoluted arrangement where we had to stagger houses so they didn't overshadow each other. And I think that, you know, having modelled this, all the houses on the winter solstice got full sun. And I mean, I think the main thing about this project is we probably wouldn't have taken that idea much further had we not been allowed to learn from it. So Bureau Heppel did a really extensive post-occupancy analysis, which involved a year of measuring the building, sensors on every single window, and then half a year interviewing people to find out why there were discrepancies in energy use. And it's a very I found it incredibly interesting, detailed analysis, but I think the big picture thing we took away from it was learning what had and hadn't worked. So, for example, some things hadn't worked as well as predicted, so electricity and water use weren't as good as they thought they were going to be. But actually, the fuel consumption was significantly better than it was on paper, and it made us think that actually passive solar design, when given a kind of residents which have real problems with paying fuel bills and feeding themselves and paying their rent, was a really good way to go. So when the RIBA had the competition for Goldsmith Street, we decided to do a passive solar scheme but at a higher density. So we were looking at densities of 85 dwellings per hectare rather than 49 on Clayfield. And I think the site itself is 10 minutes walk from the city centre in an area which is kind of quite amorphous post-war planning. You can see the kind of castle in the dark over there. So actually it's very close to the city centre. But it's also very close to one of the most popular areas to live in Norwich, which is the Gold and the Silver Triangles. So when we were doing the competition, we looked quite closely at these really kind of popular housing typologies and found out they were kind of late Victorian streets and very tightly planned. They're 14 metres apart. This is not something you'd be able to do under current planning guidelines in Norwich because you need 21 metres overlooking distances. But when we decided to try out this on the site, it kind of unlocked the scheme. We were able to provide more houses than flats by keeping the roads at 14 metres. And a result of that was we were able to keep the buildings low, so we were able to make the passive solar scheme work. So we had to then kind of argue about the overlooking distances, and the way we overcame that was to say, actually, we're going to face all the buildings the same way, so all the habitable rooms will face south. And actually the reality was that in the scheme, 75% of the habitable rooms ended up facing south, and so we'd solved the overlooking issues, except in a few instances where we actually worked with the planners to try and find ways that they were comfortable with this distance. And I think this kind of really describes the passive solar principles of, you know, allowing winter sun to heat the homes, and this time shading to avoid overheating in summer. And then some point along the process, Norwich City Council said, oh, do you think we could do passive house? And we were kind of, oh, why not? But actually, I don't think we quite realised the kind of, it wasn't quite that simple. But anyway, I mean, I think the passive house principles are similar in that they're fabric first. The walls got thicker. They're over 600 mil thick. And obviously air tightness is a massive issue. So controlling that on site is very difficult. And obviously you have a kind of MVHR to ventilate the homes. But it's now, I think, it's one of the largest passive house certified schemes in the UK. And you know, passive house modelling means everything has to be really carefully considered, where the windows in the walls are, how you detail them, you know, the shadowing, all that is part of really a kind of computer model. And the materials were, you know, chosen partly for their cost. This is £185 a square foot, so it's a really low budget scheme. And obviously robustness and maintenance is a big issue for local authorities, but they're all materials you see around Norwich. So Norwich had really close trading with Howland, and you see lots of these kind of materials, glossy black pantiles, and the white galt bricks are seen across East Anglia. And I mean, one of the really important things for us was to design a scheme that was very child-friendly, that every single house could access a play area without crossing a road. So there are various kind of different scales of landscape play areas within the scheme, but one of the kind of brave things Norwich did was allow us to put in a kind of ginnel or alleyway at the back of everyone's back gardens for small children to go and play out safely. So there are these private communal areas that are just for the residents. Which was a kind of risk for them, I think, because it's the kind of unmanaged place that local authorities don't really want to take on board, and we never managed to persuade anyone else to do it. But there are these kind of, actually this was during construction, it's now all green, but there are these kind of bigger play areas dotted around the scheme and at the edge to connect it to the other housing schemes near it. And this is the Ginnell, and actually, the feedback has been incredible generator for people to make a community. Kids, are all friends, their parents are friends. They have water fights and barbecues together. And then those Ginnells lead on to these kind of other play areas that are all car-free. So the kids just scoot all around it without having to cross a road. I think these might be, plans. This, the way that we've managed to get all the houses facing the same way is to have large kitchen dining rooms facing south and also bedrooms above it with a living room facing north. And at the top of the stairs are these extra wide living rooms. We had to redesign this because of the bedroom tax, so the size of the houses came down, so we made sure that there was a place for people to be able to stay who came to visit. And there are generally two-bedroom houses, and there's an extra wide house, which is a four-bedroom house, which has a room in the attic as well. And so that's a south-facing elevation. It has more glazing and shading, and then the north-facing elevation has smaller windows, and the living rooms, Norwich provided shutters for them to have some privacy because they give directly onto the street. The flats at the end are everyone has a front door and a private outdoor space. So there are no common parts in the scheme, which is, again, something that is hard for local authorities to manage and becomes problematic. And the way that we've achieved that is to have a scissor stair, so everyone has their own front door onto the street. You either enter into the ground floor flat, or you enter into a kind of large lobby and go up into your own flat, or around the side there's two stories to go up to your own flat. So, and everyone has south-facing amenity space. And that's it. I've got a minute and a half. I think reflections that actually since we were shortlisted, we've been slightly overwhelmed by the amount of interest. Lots of, particularly local authorities, have come to see the scheme and try and find out. And Norwich have been great at talking to people about how they've achieved it, and particularly their kind of, how they raised the bar on the environmental aspiration and why they did that. That was all born of a massive amount of kind of research as to how kind of reducing fuel poverty actually, means that people aren't in arrears on their rent, and so people don't default. And I think that kind of the message is getting across to lots of people, which is brilliant. I think one of the problems with this is it's subject to right to buy. These houses are subject to right to buy, and I think that's a major stumbling block for local authorities to be doing this kind of thing and investing in their housing stock. So it's particularly disappointing with the announcement this week that not only is it going to be local authorities who are subject to right to buy, but also housing associations. And hopefully that will change one day, and then we'll see a grand era of council housing happening again. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Annalie. The third project to be presented is London Bridge Station by Grimshaw Architects, and it'll be presented by Mark Middleton. Please welcome Mark on stage.
Thank you. I'm going to try and do the history, the context, the concepts, and the construction of the station in this presentation. So as it's the largest scheme on the shortlist at 85,000 square metres, that's roughly 8,500 metres a minute. I better get on with it, so do buckle up. So in terms of history, it's the first station built, first London termini, built in 1836, linking Greenwich with London. The viaduct was built kind of parallel to the river, so it was built about 21 foot above the ground to get out of the floodplain, but also to allow the free passage of cattle to graze along the verdant banks of the Thames, which I know would be quite difficult for people to believe, but that's why they did it. There's going to be a series of diagrams now showing the historical development of the station. Now, the reason for that is really that for two things. One is there's no Grand Plan, there's no Cubit, there's no Brunel, there's no Gilbert Scott here. It's just it grows as it needs to grow, but also as it grows, there are issues of severance. So really, as you see it grow, there are different companies involved. One side of Southwark becomes very separated from the other, and it not only becomes separated in plan, but also it becomes more of a kind of disengaged with the street level. So when you get to 1907, it's more or less as it is today, and then 2009 is when the charge started. So this is what we were left with. A lot of people here won't remember this, but this is a very divided station. Has through tracks on one side and terminating on the other, and a kind of a 70s concourse in the centre. Now, really, this is very muddled, and I think Sir John Betjeman, the poet laureate and rail enthusiast, described this as the most complicated and muddled of all London termini. This is a transformative project. There's a little bit of video reminding people of how crap it was before we arrived. Here's the way across the thing. Here's the main entrance. Nice if you like brown. Here's the very long concourse that people with the nodus roof. The platforms are unprotected. You've then got all the waiting spaces more or less on the platforms with poor things. You've got the footbridge. This was your waiting space where you had to get information. And here it is, relative to Shard. What was the catalyst? Well, London Bridge it was at the heart of the Thameslink programme, which is really is the north-south version of Crossrail, which is linking Peterborough and with the south of Brighton and Kent, and really doubling the number of passengers through the centre of London. So London Bridge, what that means for London Bridge is it goes from having 46 million passengers a year to being designed for 96 million passengers a year, and actually it's probably more close to 120 in the future as we've moved to a metro service. What that means is not only financial benefits, but the transport transposition, so moving from critical modes of transport, carbon critical modes of transport like buses and cars through to trains saves about 24 million kilograms of CO2 a year. That's just for the London Bridge portion, which is the equivalent of about running 10 shards for the year. How do we do that in rail terms? Well, we've set up the viaduct. So what we do is we've just got to switch the tracks over. So we've got to have 9 through tracks and 6 terminating, because you get twice as many trains through a through track than you do a terminating track. And really what that means for the station is a few things. We've got to unify the station for the first time, make a really nice space. We've got to link the two communities, which have been severed since 1836. We've got to humanise those journeys, make it legible, civic space that's enjoyable to use. It's an adaptive reuse project. We should only really build where we need it. We've got to adopt low-carbon strategies throughout, but also we've got to do all of that on the site of the existing station and keep it running while we're doing it. Easy. But also I would say that the other problem is, of course, is that we've got all of these interest groups. We've got people running the trains, we've got people who are working on the trains, we've got neighbours, we've got pressure groups, we've got the heritage body, we've got planners, we've got the regulations. So what we've got to find is the moment where all of these actually cross, and that point there is where we can get agreement to proceed, and we've got to get good architecture at the same time. So it's a little bit of a difficult problem. Just kind of bigging myself up there. So anyway, so what we do in terms of this video shows the concept. So we get rid of the old station because the new tracks don't allow that to stay. The existing labyrinth is cut, 75 metre wide by 185 metre cut. We need to link, at the bottom of the page is the LUL for those people who use it, sort of down here. We need to link through. So what we do is we make the existing arches wider and longer to connect the two concourses. So we've got a concourse, the LUL at the top, and this new concourse here. Stainer Street, which is an old street, we've then pedestrianised. We've tried to make it as column-free as possible and put all of the station down at the level below. So all of the retail and all the information is down there, flipping the operational concept so that we actually have we don't have any waiting at the platforms because the trains are there every 90 seconds. What that means to the plan is this is the existing plan. So you'll see here are the two links, Western Street, which doesn't exist anymore, Stainer Street. The dark grey is storage that really wasn't used, and the salmon areas are the bits who are public. So there's not very much active frontage down either street, pretty impenetrable. we go to what we've got now, which is this large street-level concourse, an internal street and an internal street through between LUL and the concourse, which is called the Western Arcade. All the blue is station operations, and all of the salmon here is all retail units, so it's all much more active frontage. And actually, this is really an adaptive reuse project. 52% of the whole project is reusing existing arches, so it's very sustainable in that regard. Next layer is put the tracks on, bang. So each of these tracks are on bridges, and the bridges hold 2 tracks and 2 platforms with a void in between. The plans are like this, so you've got, at the top of the page, you've got the terminating tracks with the shard concourse and a triangular space that links it. You've then got, on the other side, about 2 metres higher, the through tracks with the voids in the centre. So you'll see here, there's a larger space with the terminating tracks linked to shard, and this is the smaller stuff on the other side. Next is the roof. So the roof is conceived as ribbons, and it's conceived as ribbons for 2 reasons. One is the main space is below. It's kind of like London's Grand Central in that it's an internal space. So really we don't want to make a big thing and a big overall roof here. But also the building was made in strips, so we wanted to make a strip, finish it, move to the next one, and keep doing that and not go back and disrupt passengers 2 or 3 times. But we did want these ribbons, to appear like a one roof. So we actually broadened the ribbons in the centre, creating this larger space. And by doing that, we are able to lift it to get north light, but also tilt it and then lift it to get a component of south light into the station. And you put all these components together, you've got the bridge, platforms, and all of the eyebrow and all of the stuff in there. So what you then get is this city room, effectively, for Southwark, which is civic in scale, has got views out, is legible, is bathed in light. We've then clad the bridges in timber, which I think gives it a feeling of handcraft quality and kind of humanising element to it. We very quickly go through the public realm. So this is the old plan. You can see not very much public realm. Here's the change. It's now become a kind of a covered street, effectively. And I'll go through some of the entrances. So 60% of the people go from LUL to the concourse, which is down this Western Arcade, which is conceived as there are existing, this is the oldest part of the station, built in 1836, and these quadripartite brick arches are we've kept the memory of that and negotiate with those layers by using board-marked concrete. But it's also lined with shops, and these shops are not shops for stations, but shops for the local people and the working community. In Tooley Street, there's an access down to the GLA and the Tower Bridge. But this is kind of a more civic thing. It's keeping the line of the viaduct, but an open colonnade, and really this opens out to the street and creates a more civic gesture, which at night kind of really shows the station engaging with the street. Now on to construction. So this shows the kind of 3 modes, which is the station being built, the old station being used, and in the middle section here we have the station being built or constructed, and these bits are finished. We described this as open heart surgery, but whilst the patient was still jogging. And what you also get is kind of really nice pieces of innovation in terms of this. These are the columns, which are a big part of the character. We used off-site construction, and here's a time lapse showing us building it. So this is 6 years in about 35 seconds. We were located in this building here. They started demolition on our planning drawings. And you'll see elements of the station being built and then immediately used, and we're going underneath. We're kind of demolishing existing bricks and going on. So I think we'll just hang on with this for a little second. You'll see this major part here just gets demolished over a weekend. They then start to put in the all of the columns, and I'll just hang on 1 second. Here, and then you'll see the bridges come in, and then the modular construction of the canopies happens really fast. So that enabled us to build cheaper, quicker, safer, and with better quality. So here we go. There we go. Boom, boom, boom. Blink and you'll miss it. Okay. So just so we know, I think the carbon in construction is important. 10,500 tonnes. 98% of construction waste was recycled on site, including all the bricks which are in the foundations and on top of the arches. We took all the backfill on the rail, washed it and reused it. We also took a lot of the soil away by barge, taking trucks off there. But also we got the highest ever. Sequel is the BREEAM equivalent for infrastructure projects, and we received the highest ever rating. So just finally, I think London Bridge, what we've created is an identity. We've given the station that South London, I think, deserves. We've also, negotiated with the layers of history. I think we've got some really interesting spaces here and a bit of character. But also we've created this internal street and this kind of street level space, this city room for Southwark, where people can just enjoy and use, and a lot of people use it now, and they're not actually part of the travelling public. So this is the city room for Southwark. Thank you.
Thanks, Mark. Next, we will hear about the Macallan Distillery and Visitor Experience by Roger, Stirk, Harbour and Partners, which will be presented by Graham Stirk. Please welcome Graham on stage.
I can't match that pace. The Macallan is a whisky that was founded in 1824. It's only in recent decades that it's actually taken on a world reputation, and obviously its production facilities have been relatively small considering they only started marketing themselves in the 80s. In terms of the briefing, we were asked to this was the subject of a competition in 2012. That was an international competition, which we had to pre-qualify for. We were not really told where the building was and what the building would be. It was only when we received the brief we realized it was essentially three areas. It was a still house, it was a separate visitor centre, and then it was a tank farm, which essentially stood in what is the most remarkable pieces of landscape in the UK. Our understanding of whisky was fairly limited. These are the still sets of their original facility. Considering they've built an international brand, they've done incredibly well. And they did appear on a Scottish £5 note for a number of years. The site is beautiful, and one of the most problematic aspects of this is whatever you place on it, you tend to ruin it. And it is a grouping of buildings which are incredibly utilitarian, but there are some amazing moments, and this is Speyside. It's an area of great landscape value. And our site, which is highlighted red there, was a barley field, which actually, incidentally, is the only part of this development that sits under those particular controls. So our response at the competition was perhaps to make it more part of the valley, rather than replicating what you will see in more recent developments in the top right there is significant. In essence, we were asked to produce ideas which essentially we chose to maybe sink the building into the hill and to create a series of still houses that reflected the brief, which was to have 5 million litre sections that could be phased, which is where the unusual arrangement has occurred. They also wanted to create a very strong relationship with that first image, Easter Elkis House, which is the brand logo and appears on all bottles. The site itself is 8 metres higher than Easter Elkis House, so our decision to bury it and to actually then use the visitor experience as a means of being able to traverse up through to the main production levels. You can see the diagram here. The biggest risk we took on the competition is we made all of it one experience. They talked a great deal about integrity and craftsmanship. Our view was, rather than seeing a virtual representation of how whisky is made in an exhibition area, we would actually make the whole thing immersive, which has actually given us our own complexities, because in a sense, a distillery is not governed by building regulations, it's a petrochemical plant. And if you ever see a still fire, it's a river of flame. So we created this cut within the ground. You can see the individual still sets, which are probably might be familiar. The green area was the tank farm, and we buried the whole tank farm. We reduced all of the proportion of vessels. We thought it was odd to bury a building into the ground and then have a whole series of stainless steel tanks blotting the hillside. We put a service road that ran below ground, and the visitor centre became essentially the main part of the distillery itself. As you see the diagram on the right, we had no clues as to how whiskey was made. We'd done a winery, there's a completely different process. So that's us beginning to understand what part of the process of whiskey making the building represented, which wasn't all of it. We were asked to look at Scottishness, but they did say no bagpipes and kilts. And that was those words. So how far in history does one go back? Our view was to maybe, if you look on the bottom right, the image of a long cairn, burial mounds, which were obviously man-made landscapes, the steep cut into a well in Moray, which is where the district is, where the distillery is founded, and Scottish brocks, these circular little houses of twin walls, which were present in all of the landscape, and created this mounded series of structures that responded to each of the still houses. So the basic components is a steel frame over a series of circular arrangements where the actual stills are supported by all of the plethora of equipment below. So you can begin to see the actual building itself is only the visitor centre and that little control room at the back. The rest of it is an essentially unheated space because it's actually dealing with manufacturing process, which has its own demands on energy. That's an aerial view. This is 22,000 metre building. It's significant. These are drawings of process and how we arranged all the various hierarchies of the tanks to create an almost classical and theatrical display of the equipment. We wanted it to be the most beautiful, well-coordinated distillery on earth. You can see the carved privé, the sunken area. I'll just quickly go through. And the coordination our team did with all the manufacturers to create a prefabricated entity that could be replicated. And there are plans for further 2 more. And you can see its relationship to the hillside. The carved privé that forms the termination of the process. The view here, as you see it from the air. You can see what's being built behind. Those are maturation tanks. That means essentially none of the spirit from this building will be for sale for at least 10 years. You also see a biomass plant which supplies 90% of the energy, which was built simultaneously, which is used by the Forestry Commission. As we move down, compression and release. We didn't want it to be, it was supposed to be a mystery revealed. You suddenly come into this slightly cathedral-like space. The glass wall there is a symbol of our naivety, realizing that there are reasons why these buildings are placed 20 meters apart. One is occupied, the other one is a petrochemical plant. So this has been a tested wall to be able to allow people to experience the full layering and strategic layering of the process itself. And then the ascent up to basically the main tour and visitor. This is all public over these parts. You see the grid shell roof, not one curve in it, which is prefabricated, made out of ply and boxed, and steel supports that basically mark the point where the structure goes from compression into tension. This is then looking down. You see the aperture in the floor there. That opens up into the carved privé, which is a little bit of theatre, which is basically to allow people to see barrels sleeping. as one begins to move through the process of the dynamics of how you move the space, one has to really appreciate it to be there. All this glazing, it doesn't form part of the thermal envelope. It's just a shelter. It's really looking out towards beautiful Spey Valley, in contrast to the equipment I've gone in this zoom. As we move through, and this almost classical structuring of the still sets themselves elevated. The process of a ship's engine room. The chap in our office helped to assist all of this. I'm nearly done. A hole which is simply for still removal. You begin to see how it sits. You can see the big service road that sits below that. And looking across this long eyebrow, we couldn't really replicate what was already there because you can see what is already there is behind us. So we decided to make a landform, which I think to some extent is interesting in terms of how one approaches process buildings. Process buildings occupy a great deal of land area around cities. They're naturally ignored buildings, but they still form part of how we appreciate the world. And I think like any building, it should be treated with the same care and respect as anything that one would see as forming part of major cities. That's thank you.
Thank you very much. So far, they're all very good at sticking to time. The fifth story that we will hear is the Neville Holt Opera by Weatherford Watson Mann Architects, which will be presented by Chris Watson. If you can please join me in welcoming Chris to the stage.
Good evening. Which comes first, the theatre company or its building? That's the question William Archer asked back in 1907 as he puzzled to realise that the idea of a national theatre. Do you establish a company of actors, stage some successful plays, and then build them a home, or build them a theatre and only then hire some actors and hope they grow into it? This is more than a chicken and egg conundrum. It's about the difficult translation between performance and building, between the most ephemeral and most durable forms of culture, or how something as fragile as a voice shapes something as dense as stone. At Neville Holt, the stone stable courtyard has been there for 200 years, so you could perhaps say the building came first, but the beginnings of the opera festival were tentative and fragile. The first steps were 15 years ago when Grange Park Opera were invited to bring one of their productions. A scaffold theatre was built inside the courtyard to host them, and it went well enough that they returned year after year. Building up enough of an audience that 6 years ago an opera company was established to make in-house productions for the festival. Nicholas Chalmers, the artistic director, and Rosanna Rees, the general manager, built up the artistic reputation, spotting and hiring talented young singers. And when the tented scaffold started to leak, the owner of the estate was persuaded to support a permanent home for the opera. When we arrived on the scene, Nick and Rosanna gave us two challenges: to make an intimate theatre which would support young voices, and to show as much of the old stone walls as we could. So we started with the old stone room, peppered with tall ornate doorways in awkward locations, but with this incredible warmth of colour and a really suggestive quality. Peter Brook says, "A good space can't be neutral, for an impersonal sterility gives no food to the imagination." Well, this courtyard came with lots of constraints, but it definitely offered food to the imagination. Its dimensions were good, 24 by 16. Bob Essett and Anne Miners of Soundspace Vision explained that the rough stone would help diffuse the sound firmly and warmly, but they made it clear that we needed to maximize the volume to increase the reverberation, which meant digging down and building up. We thought our interventions as you'd experience them and as we'd build them, so in perspective and in a sweet sequence. To dig down for the stall seating and for the orchestra pit, we kept it away from the walls, which avoided costly underpinning, but also maintained the ground at the base of the walls so that their weight and substance weren't undermined. We placed a roof over the courtyard as high as possible while staying beneath the ridge of the existing roof, building up the volume with an independent carpentry roof structure. We inserted a balcony on 3 sides to help us get the capacity, but also to support the reflection of voices and bring performers and audience close together. Masking the stage, but keeping the walls visible there too, together the balcony and proscenium make the space of the theatre, a room within the stone room. To retain a memory of the old stable yard and give the theatre a slightly external feel, we cut a large rectangular roof light, more or less centrally. When you intervene in an existing building, you have to make clear choices about where you make contact and where you remain separate, where the new should echo the old and where it's distinct and different. We chose to connect the new roof to the old walls on a single line at the old eaves. By sitting the new roof on the existing walls, we used their structural capacity and minimised the new structure within the theatre. But this gave us a tricky moment where the 2 roof structures intersect. And with David Darby of Price & Myers, we developed a detail to thread new precast concrete padstones in between existing rafters. The padstones then support a ring beam and roof beams in steel. At the top of the stone wall, it is levelled with tiles and lime, and an ironstone string course makes a top to the wall, where the old gutter used to be. The new steel structure bears on the stone walls through these padstones, set back a little to hide irregularities in the line of the rough stonework. Pulling the new roof away from the old one conserved the inner face of the collar western slate roof of the old stable block, which allowed Max Fordhams to develop an ingenious and economical ventilation strategy with a mechanical supply. A temporary plant is hired in for the festival to supply cooled air through the floor and natural extract through acoustic attenuated air paths in the thickness of the roof. This logic of contact and separation is carried on in the interior. For the balcony and the proscenium, we planed the wood and stained it dark, keeping these elements in the background of the audience's vision, and distancing them from the lighter outer walls in stone and wood. We minimized some of the distinctions between old and new, treating this as a secondary issue to the distinction of the theatrical centre and the outer stone room. We played harmonies of texture and colour. We grit blasted the wood boards of the roof above the stone walls, giving them a texture which echoes the rough ironstone. For the new floor at the base of the old walls, we precast concrete against rough timber boards, similar to those used for the roof. So stone and wood and concrete have unexpected correspondences, and they read together as a harmonious whole. We kept the balcony off the stone walls with a clear gap on all 3 sides, and shaped its edges to respond to the doorways and the large arched entrance. We raised the balcony higher than you normally would to avoid it cutting across windows. We even kept the proscenium off the walls. The hinged wood proscenium panels allowed the relation to the stage to be shaped and tuned. So there are hundreds of small judgments about geometry and detail and material and finish. And these judgments are partly about fitting the theatre softly to the host structure, about not doing violence to the heritage. But they're also judgments made through a continuous dialogue with Bob and Anne and their team about how to make a theatre which reinforces the intensity of the encounter between public and performers. The material presence and the sense of time are crucial to this intensity. It's fairly unusual to have daylight in a performance space, but at Neville Holt, it has become part of the drama. Since the festival takes place in summer, it's still light when the performances start and finish. There isn't a foyer, just gardens and marquees, so you step in from the outside very directly into the theatre. There isn't a curtain dividing stage and auditorium, so you come into the theatrical space and the stage is there. But without that separation of the stage, how do you make the transition from the everyday to the exceptional? Last year, the audience entered and took their seats in the warm evening light. And then as the blind drew across the rooflight and the theatre darkened, the auditorium hushed with expectation, and the young voices were reflected and projected with warmth and power. You felt the performance with your whole body, not just your ears and eyes. This year, for Britain's Midsummer Night's Dream, the public entered in the dark, and at the end of the opera, daylight flooded in and the stage doors were flung open, and the landscape outside merged with the space of the opera. Our ambivalently indoor-outdoor theatre became a springboard for the imagination. In an age where you can watch pretty much anything remotely whenever you choose, it's all the more important to take part in a shared experience. The intense sense of place and time reinforce that sense that you are there, that you are not just watching online. So for us, the powerful thing about this project is how we steered the exchange of energy between youth and age, between ephemeral and durable, shaping the stone walls to the young voices, and now shaping the young company and its network of 34 schools with this robust and versatile stage. Not all things are as warm and soft as the ironstone walls, nor is everything young as affecting as a soprano. We know that ours is a niche problem and a photogenic response. But the challenge to reshape what is old and tired and to put it at the service of emerging generations is one that faces us all. At Neville Holt, this is a work of care and craft, of dialogue and teamwork. And in its own modest way, it's a transformation of an awkward inherited world into a new, vigorous one.
Thanks very much, Chris. Last on the shortlist is the Weston at the Yorkshire Sculpture Park by Filden Fowles, and it will be presented by Ed Fowles. Please join me in welcoming Ed to the stage.
Hello. It's a great privilege to be here and to be shortlisted for the Stirling Prize this year. So we were on an invited shortlist for this project some 5 years ago now. I hope many of you have been to the Yorkshire Sculpture Park. It's a place that has had a kind of growing affection for us in the practice in the years that we've worked on it. And it's a really extraordinary place set within 500 acres of parkland, which were originally landscaped in the picturesque style, but now adorned with wonderful sculpture, both modern sculpture and much more contemporary work as well. Now, the project and the brief that we were set was to create a new visitor centre at the east of the park here. The current facilities, the current visitor centre is to the north. There's other gallery spaces to the south, but there was this huge swathe of the park that was completely underused and underactivated. So when we won the competition, we were firstly quite surprised because we'd only been qualified for about a year, and the client had entrusted us to this wonderful commission. It was our first public building as well. So we spent quite a lot of time actually sat in this space just pondering the relationship between sculpture and architecture. To make a building in a sculpture park is quite a particular thing. You know, do you emulate a work of sculpture, or do you make a building that houses work, houses sculpture, and recedes back into the landscape? And We were particularly taken by the way that James Turrell intervened in the old deer lodge here and formed the sky space. Here he was playing very much with perception itself, as opposed to many of the more modernist sculptures, which are objects which are perceived in the round. And later works by Andy Goldsworthy, which have a real kind of place specificity, we were very intrigued by, as to David Nash's 71 Steps, which are in a way kind of enveloped and folded into the site itself. So these were all themes that were kind of present as we were trying to kind of wrestle with how do you make a building in a place like this, in a 18th century parkland. So the site itself was actually this great big depression. It was a former quarry where they'd mined millstone grit, which was a local sandstone used to build the dam further down the valley and many of the other buildings on the estate. The site was also very much the kind of hard edge, the boundary line to the park. And the brief for the building was to make this new entrance, a new inviting, welcoming entrance to the park. But just to the east of the site is the M1 motorway, the Huddersfield Road, this great big car park here. So the approach was very much to try and turn our back and create this buffer zone along the eastern edge of the site, but to warmly embrace the park setting to the west, to the southwest. So this is the Lower Lake. Just off screen to the right is Bretton Hall. So as we began to kind of wrestle and toy with how to kind of fold this brief into the site, we began sketching kind of in a very kind of topographic way. Like how do you begin to kind of work with the landscape, just as kind of land artists had done in the 60s and 70s. So here, Michael Heiser, in his work Double Negative, was very interested in the ability of moving outside the gallery and working with the sheer mass of whole landscapes to create works of kind of solid and void, works which really play on your sensory perception. So we were very kind of interested in this sort of era of land art and earth art and kind of working with the topography and the landscape to fold our building into the site, using techniques such as mounding the earth around the building, retaining structures to create this kind of boundary treatment to the building with a single opening which would invite you through into the park. So the resulting plan actually lies on a kind of north-south axis. You've got the M1 over here, Huddersfield Road. So it really creates this strong buffer to the east with a sort of singular, quite enigmatic entrance into the building, and then this slightly sculpted, curved elevation. The gallery, a relatively small space, but important for the kind of qualities of its environment and mental conditions. So we situated that to the north of the site, buried into the hillside, and the land actually then slopes away to the south. And the southern edge of the building is very much more a pavilion sat proud on the land, a much more lightweight structure. Here was an early kind of concept image for how we wanted to kind of forge that entrance, really kind of drawing from the kind of local geology of the site and the sort of history of the site as a former quarry. So you see the walls around the perimeter of the building retaining but create that strong boundary treatment. We did a lot of research into the local geology of the site and quarries that were still open, and we were able to source all sorts of aggregates for this wall that we intended to be almost like a sedimentary rock in itself, heavily layered and extruded up from the land itself. This was one of the worst trials, very stripy. We went through many, many iterations and many variables of both aggregate size, pigment, the degree of kind of water jet washing and exposing of the aggregates. But in a way, we wanted the building to feel as if it had always been there and feel kind of pre-weathered. So there was a lot of testing and experimentation that went on. And also to try and make it as lean a mix as possible and to reduce the cement content as much as possible. So the mix here comes close to a kind of rammed earth mix, albeit it has some cement in it to make it a bound mix. This developed into some more detailed specifications, and although the wall feels quite naturalistic and random, there was a lot of control involved in making sure that the end result was was as desired. So all of the concrete was mixed and batched on site in small batches, poured in 400 to 600 millimeter lifts, struck, and then the surface was gently water jet washed to kind of reveal this patina in the aggregates of sandstone and limestone and granite. And I think this image in particular shows the kind of relevance to the stone that we were pulling out of the ground and which now adorns the kind of perimeter of the building, and the qualities of the tones and colours in the elevation there. One of the kind of more invisible aspects of the building is this passive humidity buffer, and it's not on show in the building. It quietly operates in the background, but it's made up of 10,000 unfired clay bricks. And what it does is it moderates the humidity of the building. Clay is a hygroscopic material, so it draws in moisture when it's very humid and gives it out when it's very dry. So the building uses this to pass air through, and then it passes it into the gallery through kind of shadow gaps at the top and bottom of the gallery walls. And this is intended to achieve about 50% saving on the energy use for the air handling of the building. And to our knowledge, it's one of the only passive humidity buffers used in an art gallery. So the resulting building and the remaining kind of material palette is very much sort of resonant with the existing geology of the site and the tones of those walls. And then the gallery roof itself has this light box which pops up and is a kind of lure across the park to draw visitors from the other end of the park. We really enjoy the fact the building has these very different qualities from the south of the building, which nestles into some existing oak trees and allows this dappled light into the space, to the north of the building, where the gallery is hemmed and embedded into the hillside and has this very calm and diffuse light and very stable environmental conditions. It was also unusual for a gallery space to have the ability to have windows looking out to the landscape, but Claire Lilly, the director of programme, was very kind of keen on the gallery not being a white box space, but having a real personality and kind of being of its place and of the landscape. So largely the space is north lit to create diffuse light, but there's the ability to bring in direct light as well, which gives an added kind of opportunity for artists using the space. And then the southwest-facing restaurant space has a lot more drama and animation because of its orientation and this gentle sculpting of the south-facing proscenium, which in a way kind of cradles the edge of the park. The building gently picks up on views towards the lake, and we sculpted the landscape just to ease the view towards the lake here and to Bretton Hall. And just to conclude, I think the building, although it's a relatively modest scale, it's had a huge impact on the park in opening up several hundred acres of parkland which weren't easily accessible to the public. And it's allowed the YSP to really open up its education programme. And Fergus and I have been really kind of warmed by conversations with the public, and particularly with users of the building and the staff of the building, who are kind of arguing over whether they can work a shift in this building versus a shift in the old visitor centre. So it's been a really kind of warming, heartwarming kind of occasion to kind of complete the building and for it to be shortlisted for the Stirling Prize. So thank you.
Thanks very much, Ed. I'll now ask the architects to join me back up on stage and to start the conversation. So can I please have Dido, Annalie, Mark, Graham, Chris, and Ed join me up here. I'm aware that we don't have too much time, so rather than starting just amongst ourselves, I'll keep an eye out on the audience. So if you can please put your hand up at any point if you have a question, so that I am aware of it. And I think we have 2 roving mics, so I'll be able to direct them to the people who have questions. And if you can please wait for your turn and speak into the mic because the event is being recorded. I'd like to start with a simple question, I guess, about the point at which we decide to assess buildings. The Stirling Prize is obviously focused on recently completed projects, and I thought it was quite interesting in Annalie's presentation to start mentioning post-occupancy studies and highlight the fact that we learn lessons from buildings sometimes years, potentially even decades after they have been completed. I will ask questions, and if you want to answer, please also point out. I don't think we should go one by one for each question, otherwise we won't have time to go through very much. But maybe I'd like to start by having Annalie's take on this. What is the right time to assess the success of a project?
Well, that one was assessed in the year after use, and then, well, a year and a half after use, but I think you're right. I think you need to go back again and again if you're really going to learn, which is sometimes a bit of a scary prospect, I think, because actually you often find out that you've done things wrong, and I think, but otherwise, you're not really going to learn. I think what's a shame is that post-occupancy analysis to that extent is really rare. The only reason it happened for that building was because there was someone doing their PhD on that building, and they were sponsored by Bureau Happold. There are hardly any buildings that have been analysed to that extent. Well, then, I don't know now, but it's, the problem is who's going to fund it.
I guess one of the reasons I'm interested in this question as well, because I think the role of architectural journalism and criticism is partly to do that and to sometimes look at published projects today that have been completed a while back because they potentially somehow carry more lessons to help us kind of go forward.
Well, maybe the RIBA should go back and look at all its past Stirling winners. And do
I think that's a great idea.
I think, it'd be interesting.
I guess it's partly because when we award projects, we're hoping to learn from them, and we hope that they will inspire other projects. And I was wondering, and I might need a volunteer from the panel here, if there are past Stirling Prize winners or shortlisted projects that have had a significant impact on them as architects, because they inspired other projects because they attempted to be prototypes, or because they were doing something particularly innovative. I wonder if there are any. I'll let you think about it, but perhaps then turn to the practices that have been in this situation before, been shortlisted, or have won the Stirling Prize. What impact has it had on the practice? What does it mean to be an award-winning project? Perhaps, Chris, you can start by answering this one.
I think growing a practice is quite a slow process, and it happens in many small steps. But I think when we won the Stirling Prize in 2013, we were still quite a young practice. And it probably was then the biggest step for us in the office in its growth. I think the recognition you get just transforms the way people look at your work and your accessibility to do projects. We were in a position where we'd been competing for quite a lot of projects in the couple of years beforehand, coming second in a lot of them, and that suddenly changed, and we won 2 or 3 projects after winning the prize, which has transformed the office.
Graham, I wonder what your answer to that question would be.
Can you hear me? Is that okay?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. I suppose because we actually won once. My partner Ivan was involved in those. It was for Barracas, which was Terminal for Madrid Airport, and then won it with the Maggie Centre, which was actually such opposing scales. And I suppose to some extent, Barracas is a world building, and I suppose it generates its own activity and levels of interest. I think for us it's important philosophically to feel it's actually that one still has relevance, because there are we've experienced so many variations of drifts in ideology that exist in architecture, and how one maintains and adapts and still keeps particular core values to work within that. For us, it's a fantastic reinforcement of that. I think it's more of an internal recognition that perhaps you still are relevant, or that we produce things that at least can't be ignored, whether you hate them or love them. I think it's important that they create a reaction. And so I think for us, it's because we've been established for so long, I think it's something which is a fantastic touchstone to actually understand. I think it's probably one of the most intensive. We've been like 10 times on the shortlist, and so we've seen quite a lot of failings and how to pull particular funny faces when you've lost again. But,
and do you ever think sometimes it was the wrong project on the shortlist, that sometimes a project a year after the year before?
I'm about to think that, aren't I? I think, to be honest, because it's so variable, we're comparing projects that are all relevant, and as architects we have to have a range of skills to be able to make impacts on every building type. I think that's what's most important. We can't just, it's like, oh, why don't you do more art galleries, or why don't you do... In a sense, they're all relevant, but I think it's important to treat everything with the same level of care. So whether it's a shed, whether it's a storage warehouse, we've done quite as factories. They're all places that are required by society, and they're all built because they're needed, because that's the symbiosis of how we actually exist as a culture. So in a way, yes, I have sometimes thought, yeah, the wrong one. Especially when we lost to a Maggie Centre. I had the winery on that year, but that was my own admission. But I was very pleased, because I think I realised that the message sometimes is overarching drama, it's overarching many things. I think that's probably the thing that is good to be reminded of, and I've talked too long then, sorry.
When you say I'll keep an eye on the audience. If you have a question, please put your hand up. You're saying we're comparing projects, but I guess we can't really compare these 6 projects. Inevitably, it's a prize that has to be one winner. But each project would be the carrier of a different message. And beyond the profession, a message to the kind of the wider public. And I was wondering if you could, each of you, sort of summarize what message do you think your project would be sending out to non-architects if it were to win the Stirling Prize?
I think, sustainability is obviously a common theme across all our projects this year. And I think, the AJ have been pushing retrofit for several years, and there are a couple of schemes here. And that's obviously, an imaginative reworking of existing fabrics, obviously a very sustainable thing to do. And then we've got Passive House, and with all the incremental improvements in operational carbon, and what we're trying to do with whole life carbon, and looking at the fact, because operational carbon's come down over the years, embodied carbon as a proportion of whole life carbon has gone up, and that's something I think we would hope that, if our just being shortlisted, it gives a recognition to that issue, because I think everyone accepts that there's climate change, but I don't think there's a general acceptance whether there's a climate crisis. And I think if the second word, if that is generally accepted, then you need quite radical solutions. And I think we would hope that we just offer one model for doing things, not the answer to sustainability by any means, but just one model for doing things.
Mark?
Well, I think what's interesting about the process or the award is that I don't really feel like I'm competing with the 5 other practices, because the thing that's out of my control is that, or out of our control, all of our control, is that we are being judged against the continuum of what happened before. So as far as London Bridge is concerned, will another £1 billion project in London about a mile away from the last one win? I'm not thinking it will. And also you've got zeitgeist. What are people talking about at the minute? None of which, when I started the project in 2010, 8 years ago, was I thinking, oh, that will land really lucky because they'll be talking about infrastructure projects and that will be the big thumbs up and it's bound to win the Stirling Prize. You finish the project when you finish the project. So there's a lot of kind of things that are totally outside of our control, which is why I enjoy hearing about the different scales and the different approaches. The one thing that I love is that, there are, hundreds of thousands of people, 56 million people using our station every year. And hopefully it brings a little bit of joy into their lives. And it's not a station, it's a place, it's a street. You happen to be able to get trains there, but it's become something much more different than that. And that's, for me, I know we talk about social housing, but for me, that's social architecture, and that we're making for the public good. It illustrates what architects, what all of us can do for people every day. And that's really the greatest reward, potentially.
Annalie.
Well, it would be nice to get a message out that, councils can build great housing, but I struggle with the kind of climate that we're in that's actually going to happen. I think one of the big eye-openers to me, whilst I know about the impact austerity's had on people's lives, is because we've had to ask people to open their doors and let judges in, and got to know them and heard about what their lives were like before they moved in, seeing the real impact of people actually not being able to feed themselves, friends having to go to food banks, friends having to feed them because of their fuel bills and rent in the private sector. I kind of, we really need to make a change. It'd be nice to think this project could demonstrate that you could do it, but unless we do things like get rid of right to buy, that's not going to happen. So, I don't know.
Is it significant that a social housing project finally makes it to the Stirling Prize shortlist? Is that already a small victory?
Oh, yeah. And,
I've got £10 on it winning it.
And that'll be the last question. No spoilers.
I got 10 to 1, yeah.
That's a major, that is a major victory. And, I think it's being noticed and people are wondering why they can't do it. So you never know.
Ed, you mentioned at the end of your presentation the kind of how important the public response was as well. So I wonder, what message do you think the project is sending out, winner or shortlist? Because I think all 6 projects are already saying something, having reached the stage of the prize.
Yeah, as I said, it's been really warming to hear people's response to the building in person. But I suppose our approach has always been guided by this sort of relatively light touch on our environment, and this you can build in natural landscapes in incredibly sensitive ways, and generally relatively big buildings as well, as we've seen from the Rogers scheme. But what I really like about the kind of common theme for many of the projects is that we're all turning back to look at past methods and past approaches, and passive design has been around for hundreds of years, if not thousands, and I think there's the kind of tone of our time in architecture is about actually simplifying things and about a leanness of construction, and that's certainly something that we were aiming for with the Western. It's not kind of overtly and outwardly a green building. It doesn't shout from the rooftops, but calmly and quietly it tries to embed itself and disguise itself in its setting, to use materials sensitively, and when we are using materials which have a high embodied energy, use them with conviction and say, actually, this building is going to be here for hundreds of years. It's going to be designed simply and well and last a long time. And then fold in other technologies or simple passive forms like the clay bricks and the passive humidity buffer. But what's lovely about seeing all the schemes this evening is that there's this general theme of looking back to the past and learning from past methods.
Chris, I wonder how different almost you think, or at least for you as an architect and as a practice, the message is between 2013 with Astley Castle and this year. And yeah, how different would the message be? Because there are obvious parallels between the two projects, even if there are major differences.
Yes, indeed, and I think we work a lot with the reuse of existing buildings, and I think it's a very important part of our approach to sustainability. The things that we've been discussing in the office about those differences, what's different about it and what's similar. I think the biggest difference really is Astley was a house. It's a house where people can rent it, but it's basically for a small group of people to come together. Neville Holt, although it's quite a specific project, it's for people to come together. And I think the sort of strongest experience and sort of message I think that comes from it for me is the impact it can have on young people, young performers, and the school children who are involved in sort of outreach projects, both in the schools and then coming back to the theatre. There was a young singer who's a 15-year-old singer who was on stage for the filming, and she stood up on stage for 5 minutes and talked about the impact it was having on her, and the impact it was having on her friends, because they looked up to her and also wanted to be part of it. So I think that's probably the strongest thing.
And Graham, I wonder, I guess, is this the right or the wrong project for Roger Stirk Harbour and Partners to have on the shortlist? And what message do you think it carries?
I think I'm coming from the evil empire position here, actually. I suppose, working with scale, you are subjected to many, many external forces, which are all driven by particular aspirations and expectations, which I have to say probably exist in a twilight world of the major shifts of experimentation. Okay. Is that better? I promise I won't do it again. I think there's a great deal of buildings which are in those twilight areas, which trying to wrest them from the organizations that have control on them and to try to create something which is of relevance, that basically can create drama out of the ordinary. We are also expected to lift spirits as well. And I think sometimes one has to find a balance between what the expectations of an entity is. To see something like Pompidou that everyone said would drop to pieces within about 5 years, it's still there, it still attracts more people than Eiffel Tower and the Louvre put together. I think that has impact and it has an effect on societies. I think for our project, it has got an incredible profile in terms of how the Macallan themselves and the process that was beyond our expertise to be able to, they have to find very, very efficient ways of creating this heat because they won't be able to sell the product for 10 years. They're into this reduction because it has an effect on their business. And sometimes one has to work and exploit what is of advantage to people, and you have to convince people. I think probably our project we always viewed was, we were expected to make an impact across the world. The Macallan, there's thousands of people and jobs associated with how this product is put across the world. But to actually go to the site, they release thousands of fish into the Spey each year, which is basically salmon fry. Their whole custodial aspect of the landscape they're in, they oscillate between two values of historic, but also having a view of a wider world which has different concerns. We had to create something which was elevating the ordinary, which was actually in tune with what they were trying to create. So I suppose my view would be, whatever it is, you can still create something fantastic, and I think it's important that one treats everything with the same level, as I said in the talk, with the same level of respect, because every building deserves it.
I'm aware that we're slowly running out of time. If there are any questions, please. Yes, we have a question. Yeah.
This question's for Dido about Cork House. I just wondered, sort of in terms of innovation and research and where the project will go next, you know, in terms of as a material, whether it can be two-storey, you know, how it can be used.
Interestingly, I suppose the Cork House isn't all about Cork, which might seem a slightly strange thing to say. In as much as a design team, we had issues that we wanted to look at the outset of the research, and that was life cycle issues, a sort of dissatisfaction with the modern wall construction and the complexities, and the whole life carbon issue. We happened upon Cork as a very good material to do a lot of those building performance things. And in terms of next steps, we've had housing developers around, whether it's possible to roll out some type of SIP system. Cork's nice and light, which can keep down craneage costs. We're also looking at maybe if we went up to 2 stories, it'd probably be a hybrid structure with having some more timber in, because I think, as Oliver explained, the timber's taking the lateral and shear loads, and Cork's only good in compression, so it's limited in terms of height unless you introduced another material. But we're really interested in sort of probably other players bigger than us taking up the challenge of, you know, using low embodied carbon materials and putting them together in a way that's designed for disassembly. And I think you could use other materials other than cork, but we've got a couple of projects on the go. A few people have said they want a cork house, but I'm not quite sure they know exactly what that entails. They sort of rang up and said they want it tomorrow, and, you know, it's not a flat pack, so yeah.
We have time for another question from the floor if there is one. Otherwise, I will ask one. I might have to skip a few actually and take it to the last question, which I would like each member of the panel to answer, and I guess it's quite quick. It's a 2-part question. The first one being, who do you think should win your project set aside? And the second question, who do you think will win? Taking into account what Mark has said before, which I think is very true, that beyond the project, there is obviously a message that is being sent out. There is obviously a timeliness for particular projects. Does anyone want to? I'm aware that the timing has gone to red.
You are joking,
I guess Mark has
course,
said that. Sorry?
Sorry?
Mark has said that I mean, he's like, I put his bet forward, I guess. And it's more out of curiosity,
I'm just really glad I'm not judging it, because I don't know how you'd make a decision between them all.
I agree, because they're not comparable.
I don't think they're comparable. So, I don't know.
What I do find quite interesting is that there's a public vote, and there is obviously the judges' vote. And I found it quite interesting that as far as the AJ public vote poll last year was concerned, for example, Bloomberg was the least favourite. And but it makes me wonder that actually whether architects have a different image of what they think is important to send as a message compared to what the wider public will think. Graham's nodding. We're over time already, so I guess we are actually.
Well done, Graham.
So we might be able to get more answers out, or carry out the conversation. But for now, it just leaves me to thank the RIBA for having us all tonight, to congratulate the 6 practices once again on being on the shortlist. And of course, the winner will be announced in a week's time on 8th October at the Roundhouse. Thanks very much for joining us.